Ready to get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Derek Mosley. I'm the director of Marquette Law School's Lubar Center for Public Policy Research and Civic Education. And I want to welcome you here today to our On the Issues program focusing on the Marquette Law Poll. First, let me thank you all for being here. I understand it's the summer and it's tough to get people to come in on the summer, but it's a nice crowd. I appreciate that. And also welcome to our guests from DePaul University who are joining us here today. It's good to have you all here as well. Charles, it's good to see you. I am joined by Dr. Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law Poll. And Charles, how have you been?
I want my May back, especially after this week.
Yes, for sure, for sure. So I'm going to jump right into it. We have a lot of stuff to go through in the time that we have. So Charles, I'm just going to talk about the topics of the day that we're going to talk about. So first, we're going to talk about the methodology. You're going to let us know about what went into this poll. On this poll, we'll focus on the approval ratings of Governor Tony Evers, whether or not he should or should not run for a third term. We'll also talk about the Wisconsin legislature and the Wisconsin Supreme Court approval ratings. We're going to talk about President Trump and his approval rating as well as policies. We're going to talk about the state budget here in Wisconsin and some policy issues. Talk about schools, measles vaccinations, water issues, and local news sources. So let's jump right into it, Charles. Let's start with the methodology. Can you tell us a little bit about this poll?
Sure. So the poll was done June 13 through 19. We interviewed 873 registered voters in the state. That has a margin of error of plus or minus 4.7%. We used split samples a good bit on this poll. That gives us the ability to do half people get one set of questions, half get another. They're both random samples, but that way we can double the amount of policy questions we can get into. So for those, we either have 436 people in one half or 437 in the other half with a margin of error of plus or minus 6.6 percentage points. Partisan makeup of the poll is about where it normally is. It's 36% Republican, 32 Democratic, 32 Independent. Now that's with leaners counted as independents. When we ask the leaners, are they closer to the Republicans or closer to the Democrats? Then the balance is 46 for Republican, 42 Democrat, 12 Independent. In all the polls in 2024 combined, the samples were 33 Republican, 31 Dem, and 36 Independent. And when you put the leaners in all of 2024, it was 45 Republican, 42 Dem, and 12 Independent. There was a little bit of growth in the size of Republican identification over the course of 2024. So pooling it all together is a little bit lower than what it was late in the year and what it's been in the two polls this year. That roughly 4-point Republican advantage is what we've seen both polls this year and in the last poll or two during the fall of 2024.
All right, so let's start off with the approval rating of Governor Tony Evers.
Evers' approval is still positive. 48% approve, 46% disapprove. That's the top line of dots up there. 5% say they don't have an opinion. It will shock no one that there's a pretty big partisan gap in approval. 86% of Republicans disapprove. 91% of Democrats approve, but in the middle there for independents, it's 43 approve, 45 disapprove, so just slightly negative with independents. I should just tell you that that's down a point in approval and up a little bit in disapproval from our February poll. This is the governor's approval since he took office. You can see on the far left, he comes in and both lines are a little low because a lot of people said they don't know he's a new governor at that point. Then you see that big spike, that's the arrival of COVID. And people responded to the governor's actions during COVID very positively, as they did in many states actually. But then you saw that come down to more normal levels in the 50s where he mostly maintained until you got to the 22 re-election period when he dipped into slightly net negative territory by a couple of points in 3 polls leading up to the 22 election. Then he got a rebound after that and has been above 50% approval in most of our polls in 2024, but has been drifting slightly down so that at this point his approval is a little under 50%, though his net approval remains positive. If you look over his entire term, I don't have a slide for this, his entire term, his average approval has been 50.4%, 41.2% disapprove. And in 31 polls, his net approval has been positive, and in just 4 polls, net approval negative. So it's a pretty strong record. He remains the most popular of the political figures in the state that we ask about, but by no means is it a dominant popularity, as you can see, falling just slightly below 50% now.
So probably a question that's on a lot of people's minds, in the politics and not in the politics, should he run for a third term?
And he said he won't announce that decision until after the budget is taken care of. So at the rate we're going, that could be December. But 42% say he should seek a third term, 55% say he should not, and 2% say they don't know. Again, a big partisan gap. 93% of Republicans no, 83% of Republicans yes, so of Democrats yes. So that's 15% of Democrats saying no and 1% don't know. But among those independents, the 12% that are purely independent, it's 37% he should run, 50% not, 9% don't know.
Now you did something interesting. You actually compared if Scott Walker, former governor, ran.
Yep.
What was his party identification?
Well, one advantage of having done the poll for a while is we have numbers on that. This is from January of 2016, when it was 36% saying Walker should run again, 61% no. Again, no surprise that Democrats, 93% said no, but 59% of independents said no. And maybe a little interesting is at that point, 69% of Republicans wanted Walker to run again, but 27% did not. Now, remember, January of 16 is coming off of his presidential bid in 2015, where he dropped out in August of that year, didn't make it to the primaries, and that did hurt him in his job approval numbers at the time. But you can see by a modest margin, Evers is in a little better shape than where Walker was at that point. And of course, it didn't keep Walker from actually seeking a third term. So stay tuned for further developments on the third term front.
So let's move over to the legislature. How do people feel about the Wisconsin state legislature?
People never love legislatures, but 41% approve, 50% disapprove. We've seen worse numbers for the legislature at various points. One thing to note here is the partisan divide is not all that great. It's not like Republicans love the legislature and Democrats hate the legislature. The differences on the legislature are actually quite a bit tighter than they were for, say, Walker or Evers' job approval numbers. So a decent showing for the legislature at this point, though still 9 points underwater.
How do people feel about the best branch of government, the third branch of government? How do they feel about the courts?
Absolutely best. Future in the law for anybody from thinking about that? They like the court pretty well. 49% approve, 38% disapprove, but 13% don't know. This is by a slight margin, the best net approval for the Supreme Court that we've seen in the 7 or 8 times we've asked about it. 13% don't know is also typical that fewer people have an opinion about the court than have an opinion about the legislature, and very few people don't have an opinion about the governor. But it's not a bad showing for the court, and it's a slight improvement for the court compared to February.
Now, you did something interesting. You asked whether or not the Supreme Court election should be partisan.
Yeah.
What do people think?
So let me set it up by telling you the question. We say, which of these 2 statements comes closer even if neither one's exactly right? The first statement is, Supreme Court elections have become so partisan, we should just go ahead and elect judges on a partisan let the parties nominate judicial candidates or Supreme Court candidates. The other question is, it's better to maintain the current system of nonpartisan Supreme Court elections. So 58% say we should go to partisan elections. 42% keep the current system. There's modest partisan divide here, with 73% of Republicans saying partisan ballots, 54% of independents, but only 41% of Democrats think we should shift. You may recall that Congressman Van Orden called for moving the Supreme Court election to the November ballot. That would raise some questions about would it then be necessarily partisan or not. That's an open question, I think. We asked in February if people thought Supreme Court judges should be elected or should be chosen through some nonpartisan or nomination process. Over 90% said they wanted elected judges. So that's not really on the table. Over 80% want the judicial candidates to talk about the issues in their campaigns. But a significant number in the 60% range said they're concerned that party financing of judicial candidates is reducing the independence of the judiciary. So I think it's a mixed picture. We'll come back to this question in October and revisit the partisan, nonpartisan election side. But all of these things are potential changes taking place in public opinion and the views of the judges.
And Charles, you and I talked about this, and I told you, after being on the bench for 20 years, the thing I loved about being nonpartisan was the ability to go everywhere.
Yes.
Right? You can
Absolutely.
campaign all over the place. You can go to different events. When you're partisan, you forget a whole group that you need as constituents. So if you want my opinion.
And we do, but only if we call you on the telephone.
All right. Let's move on over to President Trump's approval rating.
There we go. Excuse me, I'm having a device problem here. So his approval is 47 approved, 52 disapprove. It was 48-51 in February, so hardly any change. Now, if you look at the national polling averages, you would see that his approval started pretty good in January, came down quite a bit into April and early May, but has come back up some since then. So obviously, if you just compare our February with our June, we don't know what happened in the middle of that period when he was sinking a bit nationally. But the bottom line is basically unchanged since February. Huge partisan divide here. 90% of Republicans approve. 98% of Democrats disapprove. When I got some of the partial data in, it was literally 100% of Democrats disapproving. So our continued surveys found that 1% more of Democrats who actually approve of him. But underwater by a fair bit with independents, something we also saw in February. 59 disapprove with independents. I want to point out one thing in passing here, and that's that 98% disapproval among Democrats. If you listen to various media sources, I'm talking mostly webcasts and podcasts and things like that, you hear an awful lot of Democratic analysts at least raising the question of whether there are a lot of Republican voters that regret that vote. I'd point to the 90% of Republicans who approve of the job he's doing. And I didn't make a slide for it, but of voters who voted for Trump in November, we have 93.5% approval of Trump in this poll. So I just point out that if you live in a world where 98% of the people agree with you in not liking Donald Trump, it may be very hard to believe that there's another side out there that does like him and haven't changed their minds. But 90% approval with Republicans and 93.5% with Trump voters, I think is pretty strong evidence that we're not really seeing a significant shift away from the president at this point, with plenty of time to see how things change.
Before we move on to the next slides, does anybody have any questions about what we've talked about so far? Yes?
I'm curious, how are you just wait one second?
We're going to get a microphone so that people over can hear, online can hear you.
I'm curious. You hearing me now?
Yes.
Oh, I'm curious. How are you getting your people that are giving their opinions? Are you calling randomly
Sure.
from
Yeah. We draw
previous
the
voters?
we draw the sample from the registered voter list for the state, so everybody's registered to vote. We send them an email and a text message inviting them to take the survey online, and about 80% go ahead and click through the link to do it online. And then we follow up with phone calls for the people that we haven't heard from to get them to respond. And so about 20% are still interviewed on the phone, but 80% are online. But the sample comes from the list, the complete list of all registered voters in the state.
Anyone else? All right. So we'll go into now some policy issues.
Okay.
So let's start with tariffs.
Tariffs are still pretty unpopular. 57% think they'll hurt the economy, 31% that it'll help the economy, 10% say it won't have much effect one way or another. That's a little bit down on the percent hurt and a little bit up in the percent help, but by a difference of 4 or 5 points from February. Tariffs were, of course, much in the news in April and early May, have been somewhat less in the news in the last month or so, but not a whole lot of change in this and still a lot of skepticism on tariffs. It is worth noting that the president's party, 61%, think his tariffs will help the economy, and so that's certainly helping maintain support in the party. But independents are solidly opposed to or think tariffs will hurt, 64%, and 95% of Democrats think they'll hurt the economy.
Excuse me, let's move on to, will Trump's policies reduce inflation?
Yeah, as you all know, inflation was the #1 concern throughout the fall campaign. 55% think his policies generally, not just tariffs, policies will raise inflation, increase inflation. 31% think they'll reduce inflation, 12% no effect. And here again, that similar party split, 61% of Republicans think that the policies will reduce inflation, but 54% of independents think it'll increase and 95% of Democrats increase.
So let's talk about the budget. Will this budget that's currently making its way through the legislature, will the federal budget, would it hit the deficit? Will it raise the deficit? Will it lower the deficit?
Yeah, a bit of a controversy on this point, but 67%, so solidly 2/3, think it will increase the federal budget deficit, 30% reduce it. But a majority of Republicans, 56%, think it will reduce the deficit. I point out, despite Senator Ron Johnson's opposition to the budget bill, the reconciliation bill, because of deficit concerns. We've heard that from Senator Rand Paul and a couple of other Republicans. I think it remains to be seen whatever passes, and goodness knows we don't know what will pass at this point, what effect that does have on the deficit, whether that actually is a concern for Republicans specifically. But independents and Democrats overwhelmingly think it will increase the deficit.
And another issue which was big in the election was immigration and deportations.
We've been asking these questions since last winter, a year ago, more than a year ago. 56% support deporting immigrants who are in the U.S. illegally. 43% are opposed. A huge majority of Republicans in favor, 93%. Independents are evenly split. And 79% of Democrats are opposed, though 21% support it. So we ask half the sample that question, but then we ask the other half the same question, but add to the end of the question, including those who've been in the country for a number of years, have jobs, and no criminal record. With that wording, it's 56% opposed, 44% in favor. So the gap there between deportations without any further elaboration, that gets higher support. But when you mention these sympathetic characteristics of long-term residents with jobs and no criminal record, then it's a majority opposed. But it's still 44% in favor of deportations, even with this most favorable wording. Both of these numbers are down just a little bit. Support for deportations in general is down 5 points from February, and for deportations including non-criminals, it's down 6 points. So there has been a little bit of downward drift in this, but it's still a fairly popular policy, certainly compared to the concerns people have about tariffs or inflation.
All right, before we move on to some state budget topics, does anybody have any questions in regards? Hold on, we're gonna get the microphone to you real quick.
Just looking at those numbers, 94, 60, 23, 56, I am always surprised that the Republicans can hold on to a majority of, of position.
Of the electorate generally, you mean? Yes. And, part of this is independents have had more disapproval or opposition to President Trump's proposals, though not all of them. Some of these are 50-50 splits with independents. But the partisan base really is quite strong, and that has helped him maintain congressional support for things. Also, while the Democrats are certainly more opposed to deportations, if we look at the first question, it's still 21% of Democrats who say deport people in the country illegally. That's far from a majority, but it's not a trivial minority on that question. So this is one where exactly who we're talking about is important, and I think our comparison of these two questions shows majority support on the one side, majority opposition on the other. The polling firm YouGov did a nice poll 2 weeks ago with about 8 or 10 different circumstances for deportations. And it won't surprise anybody that they show a wide range of support. Murderers, yeah, absolutely. Young children, no, and a lot of variation in between. So it really depends on who you're thinking about in terms of how you answer this question.
Any other questions about what we just spoke on? All right, so let's move on to the state budget. So the Wisconsin has a $4 billion surplus, and you asked the question about that.
Yeah, so again, for sort of background, the question we asked is, we first told people that the state has a budget surplus of about $4 billion at this point. How much of that surplus would you like to see given to tax reductions? And we only gave them 5 options: 100% for tax cuts, 75%, 50%, 25%, or none of it go for tax cuts. And in this slide, I've combined the 2 endpoints. So the green dot up there at 35% is people who say either 75% or 100% should go to tax cuts. But right next to it is the red dot, also at 35%, who say less than 50%, either 0 or 25% should go for tax cuts. And that 29% purple dot to the left is saying about half should go for tax cuts. So depending on how you put it together, if you put 50% or more, you're up over 2/3 want a large tax cut. If you put 50% or less, then that's also about 2/3. So you can decide whether this is a glass half empty or half full. But I think it's clear that there's a lot of support for a substantial tax cut out of that budget surplus. Now, we still have ongoing negotiations about the tax cut, so I have no idea where this will actually end up. At dinner last night, someone asked, how many questions came up that you didn't ask only developed as political issues in the last week while you were in the field? So Israel and Iran, bombing Iran, there's been a bunch of those kinds of developments. The budget is a constantly moving topic, and so this issue of tax cuts can be changing even as we sit here.
You asked about extending Medicaid for new mothers.
Yeah. This is a proposal that's been working its way through the legislature, though it's not clear at all that it'll pass. It has broad bipartisan support in the legislature with a lot of Republican and Democratic co-sponsors in both houses of the legislature. 66% would extend Medicaid coverage for new mothers for a full 12 months after birth, as opposed to the current, which I want to say is 30 days, but check me on that. But it'd be a substantial increase. But this one's got 57% opposition from Republicans, 75% support for independents, 92% among Democrats. So a bit of a partisan divide in the public, even though, as I say, there's a lot of Republican co-sponsorship on this legislation, but I'm not sure where it stands at this point.
And I thought that number, the 57% number, seemed kind of high, because I know on a national level, Vice President Vance has been talking about we need to have more babies.
Yes. Well, it's an interesting political debate. It'd be good if we heard more public discussion about this. Is this something to support new mothers, their health, the health of their children, encouraging more parenthood? Or is it, as some have argued, an extension of essentially a social benefit package or welfare that a lot of people oppose those kinds of extensions? So I think it depends a lot on how you're framing that issue. And while those of us that follow this stuff for a living are aware of the bill and some of the elements of it and so on, I think for the most part, you'd have to be a pretty attentive news reader to have really found out about this and know what's going on with it.
Let's shift our focus to the University of Wisconsin.
Yep. So the UW budget is, of course, contentious every round of budgeting, and the public is quite evenly split on this. The light purple or gray bar over to the dot over to the right, 49% say the UW budget should be held about the same. 27% say it should be increased, 23% say it should be reduced. So a very even split between increase and decrease, with that biggest group, 49%, keep it the same. In February, we asked about the $800 million increase the university had asked for, and a solid majority were opposed to that big of an increase. We didn't mention a number in this case. We just said up or down. And again, an issue that's changed is since we did this poll, the proposal for, I think it's an $83 million cut has come forward. But too late, we didn't get to ask about that one.
And this next graphic, I think it's important for you to highlight the question that you asked in regards to the budget.
So this is a second question on UW funding. A recent report, and we say this in the survey, Wisconsin ranks 44th out of 50 states in state support for public four-year universities. So we just give people that information. And then we ask, and we add, and the university has recently closed several two-year campuses across the state. So now we've given you that information. Do you think the university, and this is the university system, not UW-Madison, it's clear in the poll, that's the question. Do you think the university system has to simply live within its current funding, or do you think there should be a funding increase for the university? And 57% say live within the current support, adjust to the current support level. 41% say increased funding. So if you go back to the previous slide, increase was 27%. Now with this extra information about where we rank nationally, that goes up, but it only goes up to 41%, still favoring an increase. And a solid majority at 57% say no, keep it the same. So this is a fundamental issue for the university and a fundamental issue for the state in deciding how much support to give the university system, and with campus closures in Waukesha and other places, for example.
All right. You had a question about the partial veto.
Yep. Governor Evers has enjoyed the partial veto. We lead into this question by stating that governors have had the partial veto power for many years, so making clear that this is not something new. And that governors have sometimes used it to change the language of appropriations bills in substantially substantive ways. Do you think this is an appropriate power for the governor to have, or do you think it exceeds the power that governors should have? 54% say it exceeds their power. 32% say it's appropriate, and whatever that is, 14% say they don't know. Pretty big partisan divide on this. It's an interesting question. If party control of the governorship flips, whether partisans would change their minds on this. And the state Supreme Court recently upheld one partial veto decision, but this morning unanimously rejected another partial veto usage. So the court itself is having different rulings in different cases, different circumstances, but does show that it's a relevant issue these days.
Your next slide has to do with Citizens Initiative. Could you explain the Citizens Initiative?
California is the most prominent example where citizens can circulate petitions, get signatures, and place measures on the ballot for a public vote. Most famously, long ago, Proposition 13 limited property taxes throughout California. But these are used all the time in California for a wide variety of substantive issues. Wisconsin, despite our progressive roots in the early 1900s, has not had that citizen process for putting a measure on the ballot. You may remember on voting on ballot issues in recent elections, but those are issues that the legislature put on the ballot, not things that came up through a citizen process. So there's some talk about whether we should have that process here. There we go. 77% favor having citizen initiatives, and that's really bipartisan. 68% of Republicans, 79% of independents, 85% of Democrats. Now, this too is not something that's been widely discussed in the public, so opinions might change. For example, criticism of California is that the initiative process there is captured by interest groups. So large businesses, large organized groups get behind a petition. When I lived in Pasadena for a few months, there was not one, not two, but 3 different initiatives on the same ballot dealing with auto insurance, with a lot of doubts about what each one of them would do. And one was sponsored by the auto industry, and one was sponsored by some citizens group, and one by somebody I don't even remember. So there are some legitimate questions about whether an initiative is a great idea or a terrible idea. But this is getting the conversation started. Not that I expect us to rush to adopt an initiative, but it does, at least at first glance, produce a fair bit of public support.
Next is an issue that all the states around us have seemed to resolve, but legalizing marijuana in Wisconsin.
Yep, well, still popular, man. 67% in favor, 33% opposed. A bit of a partisan split, but 44% of Republicans in favor, 56% opposed, big majorities of independents and Democrats. Here's the trend over time. If we go back to when we first asked about this in late 2013, slightly more opposed than in favor, but that has shifted substantially by 2019, and in the time since then, support has grown from the high 50s into the mid to upper 60s. Opposition come down a bit, but legislation has not moved on this issue. We'll see, but public opinion has been relatively stable with slight increases in support rather than slight decreases.
How about special education?
Okay, so should there be a major increase in state funding for special ed in schools? We've asked this question a number of times over the last few years because it's a constant issue for school districts that have to put substantial amounts of money into special ed that not covered by the state. 71% favor this major increase, as we phrased it. 29% are opposed. Again, a little bipartisanship. Majority of Republicans, as well as independents and Democrats, favor it. Now, we've deliberately said a major increase because the exact amount has rarely been very clear. But this year, there's specific talk about having the state cover about 60% of local district special ed costs instead of the current roughly 30% that they cover. So we asked another half of the sample a question that says, the state currently covers about 30%. There's a proposal to raise that to 60%. Would you favor or oppose that? And the numbers are pretty similar. Support goes down just slightly to 66% in favor, 32 opposed. And again, across the board, all partisan groups in favor of this. So whether we say a major increase or say specifically 60%, support's pretty solid in both of those cases.
How about mental health services in schools?
Yep. Comprehensive mental health services in schools, 75% in favor of that, 54% of Republicans, 80% of independents, 95% of Democrats. We asked about this in February when it was specifically part of Governor Evers' budget proposal, including a dollar amount for it. And a majority were in favor, but there was more of a partisan divide there. This time, because the Joint Finance Committee stripped out Evers' proposal, we went with just describing should we have comprehensive mental health services in the schools, and you see the results here.
Are people satisfied in Wisconsin with their public schools?
Moderately, 63% say they're either very or somewhat satisfied. Now, there are more somewhat than very satisfied. 36% dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. It's about a 50-50 split, 49-50 with Republicans, but independents a little negative, 47 satisfied, 52 dissatisfied. Democrats, 82 satisfied, 18 dissatisfied. So fairly substantial partisan gap, though certainly not enormous by the standards of other questions.
Now you tracked that trend,
Yep.
right?
And so here's that going back to 2012. Basically, through about 2017 or so, satisfaction was a little bit higher, typically in the high 60s or mid 70s. Dropped off a little in 2018 and 19, and since then has hovered in the low 60s rather than the upper 60s. You see a sharp drop towards the end. That's in June 2024. That's when the Milwaukee Public Schools announced that they had failed to file appropriate paperwork and cost accounting and so on. And so we saw a real sharp short-term drop there, but you can see that opinion recovered quickly after that. Likewise, it dropped especially in Milwaukee, but came back up in the subsequent polls. So likely that did have an impact on opinion, but it was very short-lived.
Then you asked people, property tax reduced or increased school funding?
This is one we've asked for a long time. Are you more concerned with reducing property taxes or more concerned with increasing funding for public schools? 57% say they're more concerned with property taxes, 43% more concerned with funding schools. This has undergone a huge change over time. So way back over there on the left, you see in 2013, slightly more concerned with property taxes than with increasing school funding. But in 2015, that reversed with a lot more concern for school funding, less for property taxes. That goes into 2018 with support for school funding rising even further, property tax concern declining more. But that sort of peaked in 2018, and since then, concern for property taxes, the green line, has been moving steadily up. Concern for school funding steadily down. You see that they cross over at the end of 2022, the beginning of 2023. But the gap is continuing to widen, if not at a huge rate, still continuing to widen. This has some consequences. Our friends at the Wisconsin Policy Forum put out a report after the school referenda last November. And here's their chart. The bottom sort of light blue line is our data. That's what you just saw, the support for increased funding for schools rather than property taxes. And you can see where it rose and then where it came back down. The purple stuff is the actual percentage of referenda being passed in each year. And there's a big gap between presidential years and non-years. So that's why it gyrates up and down. But if you look at the upper level dots, you can see that that passage rate rose, peaked about the same time our opinion poll peaked, and has modestly come down. And then the lower set of dots in the less favorable years for passing referenda has also been coming down, but those were passing at a lower level. Whoop, sorry. I like this for a couple of reasons, but you know, when we tell you what the percentage support for candidates are before an election, we're either right or we're embarrassingly wrong, but it's always known a week after we've released that last poll whether we were right or not. When we poll on public policy issues, these opinion issues, there's a legitimate question about, well, that's what people say in a survey, but does it actually mean anything? And so I like this chart so much because it shows that it does mean something. When our opinion poll showed people were more supportive of school funding, more referenda passed. And as we've seen some decline in that support, more referenda are being defeated. It's still a majority of referenda that pass, but at a smaller rate, a lower rate.
And you have a chart for how people vote for a referendum.
Yeah, and so this time we asked the question, if your local school board proposed a referenda to increase taxes for schools, would you vote for or against that? 52% would vote for it, 46% would vote against it. There's some partisan divide. But here's the trend in that. On the bottom here is 2016, when it was 35 opposed, 55 in favor. Then when we asked it in 2020, it was 34-57, not much change. But this time it's 46 would oppose, 52 would vote for. So that also is showing a little bit of a decline, at least over the last 4 years, in the people that say they would vote for a referendum.
How about education standards in the state?
Yeah, so this is, do you think our standards are about where they should be? The green dot higher than they should be. The red dot, you can see not many people think they're higher than they should be. But lower than they should be is the big number out here, 58% overall, and a big chunk of each partisan group. Now that hadn't changed over time. If we go back to 2012 and since, when we've asked this question, more people say standards are lower than they should be. So this isn't a recent development, but it is a continuing image of the schools that I think is important.
How about reading?
Well, this is the fly in the ointment of that previous slide. We asked, over the last 5 years, have reading test scores in your schools gone up or down or stayed about the same? And focus on the red dot, because 40% say they don't know what's happened to reading scores in their schools. 34% think they've gone down, 21% about the same, only 4% think they've gone up. But I think it's the contrast between these two slides that lots of people think our standards are too low, but nearly half don't have the sort of not obscure information about what's the trend in test scores in recent years. And I think that's a huge problem of communicating with the public about both the successes and the failures of the school system. But a lot of people just don't pay that much attention to it. And it really shows here where they're perfectly good on giving an opinion about voting for a referendum or not, giving an opinion about property taxes or school spending. But it's of some concern that so many people don't follow such a relevant fact about school performance.
How do people feel about cell phones in schools?
Okay, we can be quick on this. Get rid of your kids' cell phones. 89% say not in classes. As a parent of a recent high school graduate, I just wonder why the 11% think their kids should have a cell phone during class.
Let me tell you, those are the ones that show up at board meetings.
That's right.
Those 11%.
And cause a certain amount of problems for board members. And it's bipartisan, as you can see. We also asked, what about in between classes during the school day, like during lunch and between class periods? It's still 72% that think kids shouldn't have their phone during school hours at all. A little more opposition to that at 28%. So this is one of those issues where the public seems really lopsided, but a handful of outspoken people can certainly make it difficult for, did I not go to the next one? I didn't go to the next one. This is the ban the cell phones during the school day. So anyway, schools will deal with that, but I don't think it'll be massive opposition if they ban them or require them to put them in a pouch on the wall or something like that.
Now, you asked about community schools on the next.
Yeah. Yeah, you can see we're obviously deep into the education issue, but this question is, if the elementary school closest to you were going to close, would you work with your neighbors to try to keep it open? And 74% say they would try to keep that school open, and that's high in every partisan category, and just demonstrates the desire to have those community schools and keep them open. That's a little bit higher in the rural parts of the state, where I think local schools are especially important and threatened with consolidation across school districts. Not enormously higher, but a little bit higher. And so schools are awfully important to the public, even if they're divided about how to fund them and what types of schools and all of that.
How about vouchers for all students?
Actually, I want a fair hearing from the school board first. This was the question: if you went to your local school board with a problem, do you think you would get a fair hearing? 51% would, but 46% not. And there is a partisan divide here, with 57% of Republicans and 55% of independents doubting they would get a fair hearing. Only a majority, 64% of Democrats, think they would get a fair hearing. So this again is back to that: who comes to the school board with complaints and how does the school boards react to that? But how does the public see that responsiveness on school matters?
I was trying to rush it.
That's okay.
Rush us through.
Yes.
So we can get to questions.
Well, let me go. Can I just go fast?
Yeah, go fast.
Do you think all kids statewide should have vouchers and go to the schools they want to? 52% say yes, 47% say no. That's a pretty close divide, a little tighter than it has been. In the past, we've seen a little bit higher, 58% support for statewide vouchers. But if you ask, in the current budget, if you had to choose between more funding for vouchers and more funding to go to private schools and more funding for public schools, then it's 69% for public, 31% for vouchers or private schools. So when there's no choice, letting everybody have vouchers is not a problem, or it's closely divided, I guess I should say. But when it is a choice between public and private, public wins pretty solidly. As you may know, there's a substantial measles outbreak in West Texas and eastern New Mexico. We asked whether vaccinations for measles, the benefits outweigh the risks or the risks outweigh the benefits. 84% say the benefits outweigh the risks. 15% say the risks outweigh the benefits. The catch is that here in Wisconsin, our overall measles vaccination rate for kindergartners is 83.8. But the standard for community immunity is 93%. So we are well below the CDC recommendations for vaccination rates. We're one of the lowest rates in the country on this. And there's not a single county in the state that reaches even 90% county in the state that reaches even 90%. So there's a real close relationship between the percent that in our survey say the benefits outweigh the risks and the actual vaccination rate for kindergartners. It's a big majority, but it's just not close to the majority that the CDC recommends. And concern about the risks is actually greater with parents of school-age kids than it is with people that don't have school-age kids. 21% of those parents with kids say the risks outweigh the benefits. 77% say the benefits outweigh the risks. It's bigger for the other groups. Now, the parents without, or the people without kids includes both older people who had kids long ago who've finished school. And of course, it includes young people who don't have kids yet at all. But it is still really striking to me that the people with kids who are directly affected are more suspicious of the vaccine rather than more in favor of it. Information about the measles outbreak is also lower with those with kids than those without. So of those who have don't have kids, the middle bar group, 33% say they've heard a lot about the measles outbreak. But of those with kids, only 18% have heard a lot. So there's a disjunction either in the information flow or what you attend to, but it does go with those folks who are actively raising school-age children. I'm going to really
go through this.
Quick. Yeah, sorry. I will make it. 79% are concerned with PFAS in their water. Okay? But only 16% have heard a lot about PFAS issues in their community. Now, that could be because they don't get that news, or it could be because their community genuinely doesn't have an issue. But concern is pretty high. And then to wrap up, we asked this number of questions about local news and availability and information. 28% say they follow local news. Specifically, we ask local news, not about national news. 28% think they follow it very closely, 53% somewhat closely, and 19% not at all. But is local news important for the well-being of your community? Half think it is important to the community, though 10% not important. What about the sources of news? Well, television news is the most cited source of local news at about 29%. But a newspaper, either in print or online, is right behind it at 27%, I think it is. And then social media like Facebook is at 20%. Everything else adds up to about 20%. Each one individually is quite small. So people do pay attention to news, but to varying degrees. But how do you get your TV news? The green dot is the way, that you'd expect to answer. On TV, dummy. Of course, I watch the news on TV. And notice that that's almost exactly the same whether you're in an urban area or an exurb or out in the rural parts of the state. That dependence on broadcast TV is about the same. But there's a substantial percent, 20% or more, that get TV news from the station's website rather than over the air or over cable. And another teens, 14, 15%, who get that TV news through social media. It's a little different for newspaper information. First of all, on newspapers, over a third, the red dots, don't get any news from a newspaper through any source. But 20% get it from the print version of the paper, 26% from a website for the paper, and another 17% through social media links or stories about news. It is a difference here, though, that in the cities, the urban areas, is much less print paper sources, whereas in the rural parts, it's much more paper. Here in the urban areas, it's much more websites, but websites are less common in the rural parts of the state. And the last thing is subscribers and non-subscribers. Just 23% say they subscribe to a local newspaper, so 77% don't. But if you look at the bottom line here, of those who don't subscribe, 13% still get newspaper news out of the printed paper. I guess they go to the barbershop. They still have newspapers at barbershops. But 23% from a website and 18% through social media. But 46% of non-subscribers say they don't get any news from newspaper sources. If you look at subscribers, it's completely reversed. 45% from the print version and 38% from the web version. So subscribers really do take in a lot of newspaper news. But non-subscribers, those freeloaders out there, are nevertheless picking up a fair bit of newspaper news. Okay, we're done.
Well done. Are there any questions in regards to the poll? We'll take questions. I'll make sure you get the mic.
I'm going to start on here and then I'll work my way over.
Okay.
I get calls asking for my opinion on stuff, but I've never done it because it seems like it's a waste of time or something.
He's the one.
Yeah, he's the one.
He's the one.
How would I know if you called me that it's a valid poll?
If it's us, the first words out of our mouth is, I'm calling on behalf of Marquette Law School Poll. Actually, we don't say law school, the Marquette Poll. Don't want to scare people with the word law in there. Where's the dean? I probably messed up now.
It was nice working with you.
Yeah, so we announced it. Yeah, I know. I'm gone. So we announced it right from the beginning. And when you get an email or a text message from us inviting you to do it, same story. The email or the text message identifies who we are. Many pollsters don't do that, but we're the only pollster out of 500 that were reviewed that got a perfect 10 score in transparency. And part of that is we've always been upfront about who we are and who we're calling, when we're calling.
Thank you.
One of the issues that always pops up with me with any of those polls, if you ask anybody, would you like to have a tax refund?
Mm-hmm.
They will say, oh, yes, of course. It doesn't matter how rich or poor you are.
Yeah.
But when you tell them, do you understand that $1 you get back in tax refund is going to cost you $100 for your local school and road repair and all the other issues? Then the question totally sounds differently.
Yeah.
And I know you sometimes try to do that, but nevertheless, when you ask a single question, it is very, very single-oriented, as with taxes. How can you really avoid that to make the poll really make sense?
Right. There are two elements to it. One is the purely polling side of it. The other is the problem of just representative democracy. You know, we have these people that we send to the legislature or to Congress, and they're supposed to read the 1,000-page bill. We don't expect ordinary citizens to know all of those details. And yet, collectively, we're still voting for everything from school board to president. And so I think in that sense, it's a structural feature of any democratic society that the vast majority of the public will not be well informed of all these issues and consequences. I generally try to frame the questions in ways that elected officials are talking about and topics that are at least somewhat in the news. And so rather than me framing the issue from scratch, I try to go with what's being talked about. That's insufficient, I realize. And there are polls out there, and certainly academic research, that will take you through 15 different policy options or how to arrange the budget. Some of them even have little sliders on the screen so that you can arrange things. Those are very interesting, but they're also kind of unrealistic for how most people make political decisions on this imperfect information. So that's both how we try to word the questions as reasonably as we can, but not overwhelm people with too many options that, again, most of us haven't thought about or been aware of.
So I know you had mentioned that the poll was given to like registered voters. I was wondering if there were like any age groups that were more overrepresented than others, and then which ones those were.
Yeah, that's a great question. People under 30 are just a shade over 15% of registered voters in the state from the voter list. And we typically get 8 or 9% of the sample that are people under 30. And that's been constant for a long, long time. I mean, not just in our poll, every poll. Your people, not my people. My people over-respond, your people under-respond. But this is why pollsters weight the data after you've collected it, because from the voter list, we know the right percentage of young people. And so in our weighted sample, young people are exactly the 15% that they represent in the registered voter list. The one flaw in that we don't have a better way to fix is if the people under 30 who do respond are different from the under 30s who don't respond, then weighting them up is not fundamentally solving the problem. So all I can do is beg people to respond. But it is a serious issue, and there are some specialty polls. The Harvard Youth Survey, for example, is a national survey done frequently only of people under 30 with a big sample. But that doesn't mean they're getting all the under 30s either. It's just it means they got a big sample of under 30s who were willing to respond. So that's a partial solution to it, but only a partial.
All right. And also kind of going based off like the question beforehand, based off the language of the questions, we saw that when there was sympathetic language attached to like the immigration question, there was a discrepancy, though it was like very little. So I'm wondering if you think that there was more sympathetic language like attached to each question, will the person who's like filling out the poll kind of think more critically about it rather than answering in a more generalized way of like what their individual party may like, stereotypically answer?
That's also a good question. I'm unsure that doing the poll stimulates a whole lot of reflection. It would be very interesting if it did. We do know that people who are polled more frequently, some people get, in certain studies, they might be interviewed 4 times before an election. A study that wants to see how opinion changes over time. And the people that are interviewed more often do have a slightly higher turnout rate. So it's, on the one hand, it could be that they're really stimulated by the questions, and so they do think more and they do vote. It could also be that those who aren't interested drop out of the poll, and so they don't get interviewed as often. And so they weren't going to vote to begin with, and they still won't vote, and they drop out of the survey. So there is some possibility of that. I think the reason we ask that immigration question, for example, in 2 different ways, and the special ed question that we asked in 2 different ways, is the difference between them gives us some sense of how much a more sympathetic wording or a less sympathetic wording makes. It doesn't tell us which one of them is in some sense absolutely true. I'd like to believe that both of them are in a sense both true, but they reflect that the different considerations people bring to answering the question or thinking about the question does matter. Thanks.
Last question?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions that refer to the university funding that I've always wondered if you could ask about. One is to say to people it's a research institute. Do you realize you're cutting research by not funding them? The other is, as I understand, there's an inverse ratio between how much the state puts into the budget and how much individuals have to pay.
Yeah.
So when people say, why is the cost going up?
Right.
It's going up because the state's not funding it.
Yeah.
So could you ask the question that way?
Right. We haven't asked either of those directly, at least not real recently at all. The research funding, I know we've never asked. The state's share of the university system budget has declined substantially over the years. That's a long-standing thing, whether you're looking 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago. The state used to put more in. Some of that's because the universities have been raising more through research funding as well as philanthropic donations to the universities, and of course tuition increases. And in recent years, the universities have tried to freeze tuition, but the costs are still the costs, and the state just, puts less into it. Back to the question about all of these divisions, we could ask a question, here's a pot of $100, how much goes to the university, how much goes to Medicare, Medicaid, research and so on, move those numbers around, you'd find that a lot of people really struggle to make those kinds of trade-offs because We don't want our trade-offs, right? We want both tax cuts and lower deficits. That just comes through in these data and in our national data. And it's, again, partly because as citizens rather than representatives, we're freed from actually having to vote directly on those choices. And it's partly because, of course, I want, you know, Lyndon Johnson had the line, don't tax me and don't tax you and don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree. And I think that still holds pretty well.
All right, can we give a round of applause to Dr. Franklin, please?
Thank you.
Once again, I want to thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it. It's the summer. You have other things you can be doing, but thank you for spending that time with us. Appreciate it. I'll also let you know that Hillary and I are hard at work getting ready for our fall lineup and our spring lineup, so we hope to see you this coming fall. Have a great rest of your week.